Boldwood presents Where We Belong, written by Sarah Bennett and read by Fran Burgoyne. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Bzz, bzz, bzz. Hope Travers groaned as the harsh sound of her alarm dragged her from the depths of sleep. Having tossed and turned for most of the night, she'd finally managed to drift off sometime after the church clock in the village had chimed a distant, single note. There'd been a few complaints about the chimes over the years, mostly from weekend commuters who liked the idea of a pretty house in the country more than the realities of village life. But Hope found them soothing. The alarm buzzed again, and she flailed her arm towards the bedside cabinet, knocking her phone off and under the bed in the process. Bzz, bzz, bzz. Muttering something unrepeatable, Hope forced her heavy head off the pillow and fumbled towards the bedside cabinet once again, managing to switch on the lamp this time. Squinting against the glare, she rolled onto her side, one hand groping on the carpet for her phone. 3 tissues, a Kit Kat wrapper, and a pair of tweezers she'd presumed lost later. Her fingers found the edge of the annoying device, and she slid it out from under the edge of the divan base. After stabbing a finger at the off button before the alarm could buzz again, Hope flopped back against her pillow with a sigh. Perhaps a few more minutes wouldn't do any harm. A gentle rap against her door was followed by a sliver of light and a waft of familiar white musk perfume, her Aunt Rowena's signature scent. "Hope, darling, I'm going to put the kettle on and then I'm going to make you something to eat. Shall I bring you up some tea?" Ignoring her gritty eyes and the beginnings of a headache pressing against her temple, Hope forced herself to sit up. "You should have stayed in bed, Ro. Just because I'm up at some ungodly hour doesn't mean you have to be." The door swung open, and Rowena padded across the room to sit on the edge of Hope's bed. She raised a hand to tuck a few strands of Hope's long, dark hair back behind her ear. "It's an exciting day for you, darling. A busy one, too. I couldn't send you off without a bit of breakfast. You'll probably be down at the site all day, so it's important you start the day off right." Hope leaned into the gentle touch of her aunt's palm with a smile. "You're too good to me." "Nonsense." Rowena leaned forward to give Hope a quick hug, her wild corkscrew curls brushing against Hope's skin like a secondary caress. They were magenta this month, a vibrant shade that looked stunning against her emerald green silk pyjamas. An artist by trade, Rowena's wardrobe was its own palette. With a soft grunt, as though the effort was too much, Rowena pushed herself to her feet. "Are you okay?" Hope pushed her covers back, ready to climb out and give her aunt a hand. Rowena waved her off with a smile. "My back's just a bit stiff. I was working on a new collage yesterday and I spent too long bent over my workbench, that's all. I'll sneak into Mina's Pilates class later, and that'll sort me out." Another knock on the door had them both turning to see Stevie, Hope's mother, standing in the doorway. "I thought I heard voices." "Go back to bed, Mum," Hope urged, keeping her voice low before they managed to wake the rest of the family up. She turned to her aunt. "You too." With an indelicate snort, Rowena knuckled her fists into the base of her spine, then headed back towards the door to stand next to her sister-in-law. "As if we're going to leave our girl to fend for herself this morning, of all mornings. Am I right, Stevie?" "Of course we're not." Hope's mother sounded as if the very idea was preposterous. They should have made a comical pair. Tall, willowy Stevie in her neutral fabrics and pixie-cut salt and pepper hair, and short, curvy Rowena with that mass of wild curls tumbling past her shoulders and almost to her waist. But somehow, they complemented each other perfectly. And not just in looks. Together they ran the exclusive hotel and spa located in their family's ancestral home, and were as close as, if not closer than, blood sisters. Hope climbed out of bed with a resigned shake of her head. You'd think I was 5, not 25, the way you two cluck after me like a pair of Reese's prize hens. She'd meant it as a joke, but she should have known better. Though they were trying hard not to show it, Hope knew today was difficult for them. "We didn't mean to fuss," her mother said, a shadow dimming the sweet smile that was never far from her lips. Rowena spoke almost on top of Stevie. "It was just an idea. If you'd rather we leave you in peace, you just have to say." And now she felt like an ungrateful brat. "It's a lovely idea, and one less thing for me to worry about. So thank you." The pair instantly brightened. "We'll leave you to get ready," Rowena said as she reached for the door and began to pull it closed behind them. "No rush." Their arrival downstairs was greeted with a chorus of happy barks from the family's motley collection of dogs, and Hope closed her eyes in silent apology to her uncles and her cousin. Once the dogs were up, everyone was up. Swallowing a sigh, Hope grabbed a hair tie from her bedside cabinet and twisted her thick hair up into a messy knot on the back of her head. She'd washed it the night before, as it took so long to dry these days. She kept promising herself she was going to get it cut off, get something manageable like a chin-length bob or one of those modern takes on a page boy style, with a nice undercut at the back to keep her neck cool during the hot summer days to come. Then something would come up at work and she'd end up cancelling her appointment and trimming the ends off herself. She wandered across the hall to the bathroom she shared with her cousin, Reese, and regarded her reflection in the mirror over the sink. With a wince, she tugged at the uneven strands of her fringe. Perhaps taking the kitchen scissors to it the other day hadn't been the wisest idea. Once everything was sorted out, she would book herself a day off and spend it indulging herself at the spa. What was the point of living on the doorstep of the most exclusive establishment in the county if she never took advantage of the facilities there? For now, she'd settle for using one of the never-ending samples her mother gave her in an effort to persuade Hope to take her skincare regime more seriously. She surveyed her cluttered half of the countertop. Her 3/4 of the countertop might be more accurate, she thought ruefully, as she eyed the motley collection of bottles, pots and tubes before plucking a pastel pink tube at random and reading the label. Brightening and lifting, Hope met her tired reflection once more. After weeks of doing battle with the planners, the architect, 3 different building contractors and various members of her family, she could do with all the help she could get. She squeezed a generous gloop of cream onto one hand and then set the tube on the edge of the sink before rubbing her palms together and massaging the cream into her skin, the way she would with her usual no-frills face wash. She only realised her mistake when her eyes began to burn and fill with tears. "Ow! Ow! Ow!" Hope forced one eye open long enough to help her find the cold tap, turning it too far in her haste to wash the mess from her face and sending a jet of icy water over the front of the thin strapped vest which served as a pyjama top. "Bloody hell!" Arching her body away from the offending spray, Hope leaned too far forward and banged her forehead on the mirrored front of the cupboard over the sink. The next words that left her lips were even less polite. "Hope Elizabeth Travers!" Whirling towards the laughing exclamation, Hope squinted through her agony to make out the familiar shape of her cousin. "It's not funny," she snapped. "I think you'll find it is," Rhys replied, still laughing as he leaned past her and tugged a towel off the wall rail. "Here, hold still a minute." He wrapped a corner of the towel around his finger and started trying to wipe the cream from her face. "I can do it myself." Hope snatched the material from his hands and scrubbed her skin clean. "I'm not 5. "I'm not 5, he mimicked, in the exaggerated voice he'd known since she was that age was guaranteed to drive her up the wall. "What do you want?" Hope said, trying to cling onto the last vestiges of her temper. "Well, I was hoping for a shower." Rhys held out his arms in a look-at-the-state-of-me gesture. With the last of the tears now wiped from her eyes, Hope was able to focus on him properly. The front of his grey t-shirt was covered in blood and various other bodily fluids, the knees of his old jeans filthy from kneeling in the dirt. What happened? "Blossom decided 3 a.m. was the perfect time to go into labour." Rhys gave a rueful shrug as he referred to one of his prize-winning sows. "I thought I'd be early enough to clean up and get changed before you were awake, but everyone seems to have decided to get up with the larks." "We're breaking ground today, so I wanted to try and get myself sorted before the builders arrive." Rhys raised a mucky hand as though to slap himself in the forehead, only remembering at the last minute where it had been not too long ago. "I completely forgot." Comprehension dawned in his eyes. "So that's why the mothers are fussing around in the kitchen." "They decided to make me breakfast." She knew she sounded ungrateful, but there was a fine line between mothering and smothering, and just lately, it felt like they'd tipped into the latter. She hung the towel back on the rack. "I'll use a shower in Mum's room." Rhys looked relieved. "Are you sure?" Hope wrinkled her nose towards him. "Your need is much greater than mine." "Gee, thanks." Rhys's laughter followed Hope along the landing as she made her way to her mother's room and the tiny ensuite her Uncle Ziggy had installed about 12 years ago in what had once been a walk-in storage space. He'd built it about the same time as he'd decamped downstairs and converted the rarely used dining room into a bedroom and bathroom for himself, having decried the inability to get into the main family bathroom now there were 2 teenagers in the house. Rhys had moved out of his tiny box room on the 3rd floor and into Ziggy's room, leaving the top floor of the farmhouse to his parents. Hope paused to look out of the window. Her mother's room was at the front of the farmhouse, offering a gorgeous view across the sprawling parkland of the estate towards the Palladian-style mansion that dominated the landscape. Built in the early 17th century and altered and extended by many subsequent generations, the family had decamped from Stourton Hall, or just the Hall, as everyone referred to it, when the 4 Travers siblings had decided it was time for radical change. Their father, Hope and Rhys's grandfather, Monty, had shown zero interest in taking up the reins of the estate management from his own father, and things had grown rather neglected under his brief spell in charge. Zap and Ziggy had barely been out of university when they'd confronted Monty about the perilous state of the family finances, not to mention the leaky roof and ancient electrics, which were a fire disaster waiting to happen. With barely a murmur of protest, Monty had signed responsibility for the estate over to his 4 children, and he and his wife Alice had loaded up their worldly goods on the back of their VW camper and headed off to explore the world. They rattled their way home every now and again, staying long enough to cause chaos and renew their prescriptions before they went off again on a new adventure. It had been during their last visit home, a riotous and very merry Christmas, that Hope had decided she needed a space of her own. She adored her family, but some days she just wanted to shut the door on everyone and everything, which was simply impossible when you lived under the same roof with 5 other adults, 7 when her grandparents landed. Hope cast one last look at the hall. When she'd been a little girl, she'd loved to explore the opulent guest suites and imagine one of them was her bedroom. Now, for all they lived on top of each other in the farmhouse, Hope was grateful that her uncles and her mother had seized the opportunity and made the most of the family assets. Not only had they saved the hall from potential ruin, they'd created a huge range of opportunities for both the family and many of the residents in nearby Stourton in the Vale. Now it was Hope's turn to claim a little corner of the estate for herself. She checked the clock on her mother's bedside table and gasped when she saw the time. So much for getting ahead of things. The builders would be here in less than an hour. Chapter 2. 30 minutes later, a half-eaten bacon roll in one hand and a thermos cup of coffee in the other, Hope rushed out the back door of the farmhouse, calling thanks to her mum and Rowena. Sooty and Sweep, her pair of black Labradors, shot out into the yard, determined to join her. It cost her the remains of her roll, but she managed to coax them back inside with the help of Ziggy, who'd been woken by all the kerfuffle just as she'd feared. With a quick apology to him for the noise, she managed to slip back out the door and shut it before her two hellion pups could stage a second breakout. They normally joined her wherever she went, and even had baskets in the corner of her office. But there was no way she could take them to the work site. It just wasn't safe. Still, their desperate yowls and whines at being left behind shredded her heart, and she promised to make time to take them on an extra long walk later. She made her way over to the small fleet of black Range Rovers, each bearing the discreet logo her Uncle Ziggy had designed on the bonnet and on each of the front doors. He'd chosen a sprig of greenery with a bright purple berry next to the words Juniper Meadows in a swirling calligraphy font, the name he and the others had opted for when rebranding the estate. They used it for everything, from labelling the award-winning gin Zap made at their private distillery to the luxury toiletries available in every guest room in the hotel and spa. It was even on the packaging of the free-range organic meat and dairy products from the farm's estate, which Reese managed. Hope pointed the set of keys she'd grabbed off the kitchen table and aimed it at the row of cars. The orange hazard lights on the one nearest the gate flashed. By the time she'd secured her coffee in the drinks holder and adjusted the seat so she could reach the pedals, the perils of being 5'4" in a family of 6-foot-tall men, Reese had appeared to unlock the gate for her. His border collie, Samson, sat smartly at his heels, and Hope could only sigh at how well-behaved her cousin's dog was. She kept meaning to sign Sooty and Sweep up for some training classes, but that was even further down her to-do list than finding time to get a proper haircut. The sight of Reese's other dog, a miniature dachshund named Delilah, nestled in his arms like the spoiled princess she was, cheered Hope up. He might be the dog whisperer when it came to Samson, but Delilah was a diva from the tip of her nose to the end of her stubby little tail. "Thanks for saving me a job," she called to Reese through the open passenger window. "It's no hassle. I'm on my way back to check on Blossom and her litter. Make sure they're all bonding." "Take some photos for the Instagram page," he said, cutting her off with a laugh. He raised a hand to pat the phone in his top pocket. "Don't worry. You can rely on me." The truth of those words struck her heart like an arrow shot from Robin Hood's bow. 18 months older than her, Reese had been a big brother to her in every way that mattered. They'd been inseparable. 2 musketeers. He'd been there to help her with everything from learning to tie her shoelaces to chasing off unsuitable boyfriends. She hoped her moving out wouldn't change things between them. "You'll come to dinner all the time, won't you?" "I'll be there so much you'll be sick of the sight of me," he promised with a grin. Leaning down, He rested one arm on the open window of the car, the other still holding Delilah securely against his chest.
"You've got this."
It wasn't much of a pep talk, but it was everything she needed to hear. "Thanks, Reese. I'd better get going." He stepped back and kept one hand on the gate until she was safely on the other side. Though she knew he would lock it properly, she still watched via the rear-view mirror until he'd secured it and wandered off towards the barn with a wave, Samson as close as a shadow. Only then did she turn her attention to the road ahead. Hope glanced left in the direction of the hall, then to the right, which would take her towards the main entrance of the estate. The roads around their grounds were never very busy, but it was one of the habits drilled into her when Ziggy had been teaching her to drive, and she'd never forgotten it. More than one visitor to the spa had found themselves nose to nose with Reese's prize herd of cows as they crossed from the pasture to the milking shed. As she rounded the bend and turned off the long chestnut-lined drive, heading towards the east gate which they used for deliveries and other trade visitors, she focused her attention on the day ahead. The heavy equipment was arriving today, and with the compound already set up, she'd hoped they'd be digging the foundations before lunchtime. She was still some distance away from the east entrance when she spotted a flash of bright yellow, and her heart skipped a beat. By the time she'd pulled up in front of the gate, the huge digger dominated her view, its bucket raised high against the pale blue of the early morning sky. It's really happening. Her stomach was suddenly a fluttering mass, and she began to regret the bacon roll. Get a grip. She'd made the decision to project manage the house build herself. Should have been a walk in the park for the operations manager of the family gin distillery, but somehow she kept finding herself on the wrong foot. The proposed site manager from the first building company she'd spoken to had called her Babes and waved off her request to see his construction plan. The second firm had been impossible to pin down on anything to do with dates, or more importantly, costs, and had just kept reassuring her that they could do it within budget. She hadn't been reassured. Thankfully, the firm she'd finally signed a contract with had proven sensible and professional, dealing with all her inquiries and one or two last-minute panics on her part, with polite and timely responses. Hope pressed a hand to her roiling stomach. Throwing up in front of the site team would not make a great impression. You've got this. Having performed a quick 3-point turn in front of the gate so she'd be facing in the right direction to lead the crew through the grounds, Hope climbed out of the car and set her shoulders straight. The first person she saw was Declan, the site manager, leaning against the bonnet of his truck. He straightened up the moment he saw her, and her nerves began to settle. "Good morning. I hope I haven't kept you all waiting," she called as she pressed the remote control that opened the gates.
"No, you're fine," Declan reassured her as he stepped forward and offered her his hand. "We've only been here a few minutes. I wanted to get the digger off the roads before the local traffic gets busy. The last thing we want is to annoy people before we've even started."
"That's thoughtful of you." Hope offered him the remote control. "Here, while I remember. I've signed it out on your behalf for the duration of the project. If you need any more, then let me know and I'll speak to my uncle."
"Cheers."
Declan tucked the remote into his pocket before he turned to gesture towards the small convoy of vehicles lined up behind his truck.
"One more might be handy in case I'm delayed. There's no rush for it. I'll introduce you to everyone once we get to the site, if that's all right with you."
"Sounds good." Hope tilted her head to see past Declan and waved acknowledgement to a couple of the crew, who each raised a hand in greeting.
"Let's get going, shall we?"
10 minutes later, they were parked up in the secure zone Declan had overseen the building of the previous week. 2 large porter cabins formed one corner of the compound, a site office and a canteen/welfare unit. Hope had been shown around them and been impressed with the facilities. A bank of portable toilets stood on the far side of the canteen, and a large metal storage container for tools and equipment completed the setup. Through the metal fencing, the coloured flags tied to the stakes marking out the site of what would soon be Hope's new home fluttered in the light summer breeze. Her gaze wandered from the pristine grass to the huge oak tree some distance away, and the jumble of fallen stones, half overgrown, that littered the ground beneath it. The remains were of an old chapel according to family legend, but there was no information about who had built it or when. It had always been Hope's favourite spot on the estate, and one of the reasons she'd chosen this little plot to build her own home. She turned her attention back to the little flags, trying to overlay the architect's vision on the blank turf. As this was a private part of the estate, she decided against any kind of perimeter fence, so she'd have an uninterrupted view of the oak tree in ruins through what would be her back patio windows. "Miss Travers?" Hope jumped at the sound of Declan's voice, and when she turned to face him, the quizzical look on his face said it wasn't the first attempt to catch her attention. "Sorry, I was miles away." She stepped away from the fence, hoping her face didn't look as hot with embarrassment as it felt. The site manager smiled. "Daydreaming about what your new place is going to look like?" "That obvious," she replied with a laugh. Looking around, she realised the rest of the crew were watching them, each one wearing a hard hat and a high-vis vest. Her cheeks flushed again. "I'm sorry, I'm holding you up again, aren't I? I'll get out of your way and leave you to get on with things." She was already fumbling in her pocket for the keys to her vehicle before she'd finished speaking. Declan's smile softened. "You're not in the way, Miss Travers. You're the project manager, remember?" "Well, yes, but that's more to do with managing the budget. What I know about construction work you could write on the back of a stamp and still have room. It wasn't my intention to hang around the site looking over your shoulder." "Well, that's certainly a relief," Declan said with a grin that made his white teeth stand out against his tan. It wasn't the kind of skin tone one got on holiday, more that deeply ingrained colour of someone who spent most of their working life outdoors in the elements. "But you are welcome on site whenever you like, though I'd prefer it if you stuck to the compound unless I'm with you." "Of course." Hope was in charge of overseeing the health and safety at the distillery. The risks were far fewer than on a construction site, but they were very careful about visitor safety during the tours they ran. Declan nodded in thanks at her swift agreement. "Look, unless you've got to rush off, I'm about to give everyone a safety briefing and run through the work programme if you'd like to sit in on it." "As long as I won't be in the way." "I'll get the kettle on," the man nearest the welfare unit called to them. "Cup of tea, Miss Travers?" "Lovely, but you must all call me Hope, please." An hour later, and Hope was on first-name terms with the entire crew, and had admired photos of everyone's children, pets, garden water features, and whatever else they'd wanted to show off to her. They'd given her first choice from the biscuit tin, and answered all of the questions she'd asked without ever making her feel silly. As they trooped out of the canteen and headed towards the site, Hope found herself smiling as she met Declan's eyes. "Quite a team you've got there," she said. "They're on their best behaviour. It'll be a different story when you're not around." As though to prove the point, Paul, the operative in charge of the digger, dropped his keys and swore in a manner that was surprisingly inventive, if anatomically unachievable. "Language!" bellowed Declan as he gave Hope an apologetic smile. "Sorry." A blushing Paul raised his hand before turning and scurrying after the rest of the crew. Hope laughed. "I won't faint, don't worry," she assured the irritated site manager as she followed him down the steps. She didn't add that in his role of surrogate big brother, Reese had delighted in teaching her rude words and then double-dog daring her to use them in front of the rest of the family. It had cost her more than a few time-outs on the stairs, but a double-dog dare just couldn't be ignored. "Thanks again for letting me sit in on the briefing. It was really useful." Obviously grateful at the way she'd steered the conversation back to more comfortable territory, Declan gave her a relieved grin. "You're about the only person who's ever enjoyed a site safety briefing. Are you heading off, or do you have time to stick around a bit longer? I thought you might want to watch us officially break ground." It was really happening. "I'd love that, if you're sure you don't mind." "Not a bit. Wait here and I'll get you a spare hard hat and vest." With her protective gear on, Hope followed Declan to a spot well clear of where Paul was going through his final inspection of the digger, and promised not to move. She was as close to the perimeter of the site while still being on the working side of the fence. She was too far away to hear the conversation between Declan and the rest of the crew, but that didn't matter. It was exciting enough to be able to witness these first few steps. Tony, one of the other crew, started up a machine that looked like a cross between a lawnmower and a quad bike, although he walked behind it rather than riding it. He crossed the marked-out area, turned, and headed back to where he'd started. She watched, puzzled, as he repeated the action a few more times. As he turned to start another run, a couple of other members of the crew bent down and began rolling the turf. Within just a few minutes, they'd cleared a good section and tossed the stripped turf into a large skip. Tony and the others moved out of the way while Declan glanced up to where Hope hadn't moved from her allocated spot. She gave him a quick thumbs up, and, with a nod, he turned and signalled to Paul, who was waiting in the driver's seat of the digger. He started up the engine, and the vibration of it seemed to resonate through the ground beneath Hope's feet. This was it, the start of her journey towards true independence. Head full of the dreams of the first supper party she would throw. It would be early autumn if everything went to plan. Hopefully they'd enjoy an Indian summer weekend or two, so she could set the table in front of the open patio doors, perhaps even outside. She watched as the first half-dozen buckets of soil were dug up and emptied out into the skip on top of the clear turf. There was something almost hypnotic about the movements of the digger's arm. It was clear that Paul knew exactly what he was doing by the fluid way he steered the big machine. The bucket dipped again, and a terrible scraping noise filled the air. Declan yelled something over the noise of the digger, his arms waving frantically. The engine cut off, the silence shocking after the heavy roar and rumble of the machine, and Paul jumped down from the cab and jogged over to stand beside Declan. The two men stared down into the hole, Declan with his hands on his hips, Paul pushing back his hard hat to scratch his brow. Hope popped up on her tiptoes, desperate to see what they were looking at, but it was impossible from her position. She wanted to rush over. She'd promised Declan she wouldn't move. She settled for calling out, "Is everything okay?" Declan raised his head briefly to look at her, but didn't speak, his attention already drawn back to the hole. He said something to Paul, who nodded and hurriedly climbed back into the digger while Declan stepped back out of the way. The digger roared back to life, but only long enough for Paul to raise the bucket and lock it in its highest position before he turned off the engine and clambered back down again. When Declan joined him by the hole, the pair of them went down on their knees, and Hope watched as the site manager leaned forward until his head and shoulders disappeared from view. He raised his head and called to one of the other crew members who were standing around, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. "There should be a dustpan and brush in the store. Fetch it for me." The man hurried off, returning a short time later with the requested item. Ignoring the dustpan, Declan took the brush and leaned back into the hole. The rest of the crew had now gathered round, and Hope found herself edging forward, although there was nothing to see beyond the wall of broad shoulders. When her foot caught on one of the boundary stakes, she stumbled and just managed to catch her balance before she fell flat on her face. Chastened, she returned to her original spot and sat down, hands curled around her knees. She wanted to call out again, to demand Declan tell her what was going on. She forced herself to remain quiet. He knew she was there, and it was better to be patient and get a proper answer about what was going on than to interrupt him for him to tell her he didn't know yet. That awful, roiling feeling in her stomach returned. Whatever was going on, Hope had a bad feeling about it. Chapter 3. Dear Dr. Ferguson, the committee regrets to inform you that your recent application has not been successful on this occasion. Shit. Cameron slammed the lid of his laptop closed, then leaned forward to gently bang his forehead on his desk. Shit, 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 shit. The door to the cramped square of space the university laughingly called his office swung open to admit the departmental secretary. The briskly efficient Mrs. Cotteridge kept watch over Cam and the other junior lecturers in the university archaeology department with the patient exasperation of a veteran sheepdog. A fan of rock and roll, she sported an impressive beehive that never wilted even on a morning so warm Cam already had his desk fan on at full blast. She swept into the tiny office, filling the air with the light floral perfume Cam suspected had been her signature scent for as long as the beehive had been her hairstyle of choice. "Don't do that, dear," she admonished gently as she reached for the half-drunk cup of coffee on Cam's desk. "You'll give yourself a headache." "I didn't get the funding," Cam grumbled, knowing he sounded as hard done by as one of his first-year students whining about a poor grade. "That's a shame," Mrs. Cotteridge said in that same no-nonsense tone. "Do buck up. There's a visitor outside and you're the only one available." Cam tilted his head up to glare at Mrs. Cotteridge. "I'm not available. I've got far too much work to do." The look he received would have done Medusa proud, and he dropped his forehead back on his desk in case she really did have the power to turn him to stone. "Where's Barney?" he mumbled, referring to his best friend and former roommate when the two of them had been undergraduates. "Can't he deal with it?" "Dr. Barnard is busy writing his end-of-term reports and not skulking about like a wet weekend." "Ouch." Sitting up, Cam pressed a hand to his heart. "Direct hit, Mrs. C." Mrs. Cotteridge clucked her tongue, but her stony gaze softened somewhat. "I know you are banking everything on that funding for the summer, but perhaps you didn't get it for a reason." Before Cam could even begin to fathom out her cryptic comment, Mrs. Cotteridge raised her voice and called out, "Dr. Ferguson will see you now, Miss Travers." Giving Cameron a wink. A wink? Had she been on the gin? She turned on her heel and walked the 5 paces that carried her out of his office. She'd barely cleared the door when she was replaced by a woman so stunningly pretty that he forgot all about his bitter disappointment over the committee's funding rejection. With her long, dark hair bound up in a thick ponytail and her casual t-shirt and jeans, she looked at first glance as though she might be a student. The instant flash of attraction burned to ash,
Cameron had very strict rules when it came to his private life. He'd been on the end of more than one student crush and had found them excruciatingly awkward to deal with. One of the reasons Mrs. Cotteridge was such a godsend was her instinctive radar for such things. She was always kind and protective towards the students involved, while gently repelling any requests for one-to-one tutorials and the like. The crushes never lasted long, and Cam didn't flatter himself that he was anything particularly special in the looks department. University was a big step up for many young people, and they were bound to try and stretch their wings a little bit. He studied the woman standing before him with the same eye for small details that he used when out on a dig. There was a confidence to her stance, a tilt to her head that said she considered him an equal, and he revised her age up by several years. Realising he'd been silent for longer than could be considered polite, Cam jumped to his feet, almost knocking his chair flying in his haste. "Good morning, Miss—" His mind blanked on the name Miss Cotteridge had given. Damn. Get a grip, Ferguson. "Travers. Hope Travers." Holding out a hand, she entered his office. "I'm not interrupting anything important, I hope." No, whoever she was definitely not a student. Cam shook her hand and released it, noting in the brief moment of contact how nicely her palm tucked into his own. "Cameron Ferguson. My friends call me Cam." Oh, God. Why'd he said that? Feeling ridiculously flustered, Cam dropped back into his chair and gestured towards her. "Please, have a seat." With a raised eyebrow, he saw Miss Travers take in the cluttered disaster zone that was his office. Books, papers, and plaster cast specimens littered every available surface, including, he noticed with a wince, a tottering stack of research books he checked out of the library and dumped on the chair he used for visitors. "Sorry." Bouncing back up, Cam rounded his desk and gathered up the pile. He turned in a circle, hunting in vain for an alternative space to put them. "It's not always this chaotic," he lied, not wanting her to believe the worst of him. A human chaos bomb, that's what Barney called him. He did try to keep on top of things, but somehow he ended up getting distracted, and before he knew it, things were a mess again. The only place he practiced ruthless discipline was when he was out on site. So many of their finds were delicate fragments, easily lost or damaged. One act of carelessness could ruin an entire summer's work. He shot Miss Travers an apologetic smile. "End of term and all that. I need a good clear-out." "It's fine. I'm the one who should be apologising for turning up unannounced." Miss Travers swept a hand behind her as though she was more used to wearing a skirt or a dress that needed smoothing down rather than jeans and a t-shirt, and sat down crossing her legs at the ankles. The action drew attention to the heavy work boots on her feet. They looked new, for all the treads on the soles had some mud embedded in them. Miss Travers was a whole lot of contradictions. Realising he was still standing, Cam hurried back behind his desk, dumping the reference books on the floor for want of anywhere else to put them. Folding his arms atop his desk, he leaned forward and tried to remember he was a professional, even if he'd given Miss Travers no sign of it so far. "So, how can I help you today?" Miss Travers rocked over onto one hip, leaning back at the same time to give herself enough room to reach a hand into her pocket. The action pushed her breasts forward against the dark navy cotton of her t-shirt, and Cam averted his gaze. What was wrong with him? He'd been alone in his tiny cubbyhole of an office with dozens of women, and never once been as aware of them as he was with Miss Travers. Something clicked softly on the surface of his desk, and Cam turned back. One glance at the small, dark object Miss Travers had placed on his desk had Cam fumbling in the top drawer of his desk for his glasses. He shoved them on and reached for the object, his fingers freezing inches from the dark, dirt-encrusted treasure. "Where did you find this?" He heard rather than saw her sit forward, his eyes still glued on what she'd brought to him. "Do you know what it is?" "Possibly." Spinning around in his chair, he started pulling the kit he needed from the cabinet behind him. A soft toothbrush, a fines tray, a wooden toothpick and a cloth. Setting them before him on the desk, he reached for the object, froze again, and looked at Miss Travers. "May I?" She gave a little shrug. "Of course." Cam placed the item in the fines tray and studied it for a long moment before he rummaged through the cluttered contents of his desk drawer and retrieved a jeweller's loupe. Using the handheld magnifier, he examined the find once more, flipping it over to check both sides. It was in remarkably good condition, even covered in dirt as it was. Using the toothbrush, Cam began to gently brush the item, the soft bristles following the grooves on the convex side of the find. Swapping the toothbrush for the toothpick, he scraped the underside, loosening the worst of the clump of dirt that had filled the little hollow. It would need a proper clean in the conservation lab, but he'd done enough for now to confirm his first impression. He placed it on the cloth and held it out to show Miss Travers. "It's a seashell," she said, voice filled with wonder. "A scallop shell," he clarified. "It's a pilgrim badge, a symbol of St. James the Apostle." "A badge?" Cam nodded. "See the little loop at the top? It would be pinned to a cap or threaded onto a piece of leather and worn around the neck." He looked up at Miss Travers once more. "Where did you find it?" "At home, on a construction site." She reached for the badge. "Can I have another look now it's clean?" He wanted to say no, but he didn't want to risk putting her back up before he knew more about where she'd found it. "Sure, but probably best to keep it on the cloth. It's made of lead, so you should wash your hands before you eat or drink anything to be on the safe side. I'll also need to pack it properly before it starts to corrode." When she opened her palm, Cam extended his to meet it, sliding the cloth across until the badge rested in the centre of her hand. The tips of their fingers grazed in the process, and Cam found himself curling his hand closed as though he could somehow trap the sensation. "You said you found it at home, Miss Travers," he prompted, watching as she turned her hand this way and that, her gaze transfixed on the little shell. "Please, call me Hope. And yes, I found it on the grounds. I live at Juniper Meadows." She said it like he was supposed to recognise the name. When he didn't respond, she lifted her eyes to meet his, her lips curled into a smile. "I suppose someone in your field might recognise its more formal name. Stourton Hall." "Stourton Hall?" Cam rocked back in his seat at her mention of one of the finest examples of Jacobean architecture in the region. It wasn't his particular specialty, his personal and research interest being ecclesiastical buildings, but he knew Barney would chew his own arm off at the chance to have a nose around the hall. Miss Travers, Hope, had travelled at least a couple of hours to see him that morning. Well, to see someone from the department, he mentally corrected himself, because she hadn't come to visit him specifically. The hall was part of a massive country estate, one of the largest in the area still in private hands. He'd grown up on a very different kind of estate, in a little two-up, two-down council house on the outskirts of York. Unless Hope was an employee, She might well be an aristocrat of some description. You live at Stourton Hall?
Hope laughed. Not exactly. My family decamped from there when it was refurbished, a few years before I was born. We live in the estate farmhouse, and the hall is a hotel and spa. My uncle thought Stourton Hall sounded a bit stuffy and old-fashioned, so he rebranded it when we opened to the public.
Juniper Meadows, Cam said, connecting the dots. He had to agree that it sounded more inviting. Making a mental note to do a bit more research later, he turned the conversation back to his original question. You mentioned refurbishments. Is that how you found the badge? Hope set the badge and cloth down on his desk and sat back in her chair.
Yes. Well, not exactly. I didn't find it at the hall. She laughed. Technically, I didn't find it at all. My contractors did. I'm having a house built, you see.
Not sure he did see, Cam made a non-committal sound and gestured for her to continue.
It's a bit crowded at the farm, and I wanted my own little place. There's a spot I love on the estate with an old oak tree and the chapel ruins. It's out of the way of everything else, and I thought it would be the perfect site.
Chapel? Cam sat up at that, his interest piqued. Hope shrugged.
Well, that's what I've been told it was. It's now just a few jumbled stones that are mostly overgrown. She sighed. The plot I chose for the house was well away from both the oak tree and the ruins, but not far enough away, apparently.
Cam held his hands up, thoroughly confused now. You found the badge at the chapel ruins? Hope shook her head.
No, I found it at the other ruins, or perhaps it's the same ruins. How should I know? The digger hit something within the first couple of scoops, and the crew stopped work immediately.
At the mention of other ruins, Cam felt a familiar sense of excitement building inside him. I don't suppose you took any photographs of the site?
Oh, yes, sorry. That's the first thing I should have shown you.
Looking a touch embarrassed, Hope leaned forward in the chair and pulled her phone out from the back pocket of her jeans.
Sorry, this whole thing has completely thrown me for a loop. Declan said if we were lucky, it might just be a dumping ground for a few spare stones left over from when the chapel was built.
It could be, Cam said, in the most neutral tone he could manage. On the one hand, it would be a relief to Hope if it was just a handful of stray stones so she could get on with her house-building project. On the other hand, I can't promise I'll be able to tell anything just from the pictures, he warned her.
No, of course not. But you'll surely have a better idea than I do of what we might be dealing with.
She passed him the handset with a rueful grin.
Just looks like a jumble of old rubbish to me, but perhaps that's wishful thinking on my part.
The second he laid eyes on the first image, he knew her wish wasn't going to come true. He remained silent, though, taking his time to study each of the dozen images, making sure he wasn't letting his own desire for it to be something of interest unduly influence his opinion. And whereabouts did you find the badge? Hope reached forward and scrolled back through the images to one he hadn't seen before. It showed the layout of the construction site before the ground had been disturbed. She tapped a finger on a large yellow skip sitting on the far side of the site.
I don't know exactly. One of the guys spotted it sticking out of the top of the discarded soil.
She gave him an apologetic glance.
He'd already climbed in and fished it out before I knew anything about it, so I don't have a photo of it in situ.
Cam gave her a reassuring smile. It's not your fault, and if it was sitting in the soil pile, then it would be impossible to tell where it had come from. He pressed the home button on the phone to close the photo app, an automatic action on his part. He
He was about to hand it back to her when he noticed the home screen image. It was Hope and a man he guessed to be around the same age. They were grinning into the camera, each clutching an enormous ice cream, their eyes shielded behind sunglasses. The dark-haired man had an arm slung casually around her shoulders. He passed the phone back to her, trying to ignore a pang of regret. Of course someone this pretty was going to have a boyfriend. "So, what's the verdict?" she asked, having tucked her phone away. When he remained silent, the corners of her mouth slipped down, and he hated that he was the one who had chased away that pretty, sunny smile. "I'm not going to be able to go ahead, am I?" Cam shook his head. "Someone will need to come out to the site and have a proper look, but it's definitely going to need some further investigation." He reached into his desk drawer and retrieved the battered organiser he kept all his contacts in. He pulled out a slightly dog-eared card and slid it across the desk to her. "This is the number of the county archaeologist. He'll be able to advise you further and put you in touch with someone who can carry out a site survey. They'll also need to do a desk survey and search through any archival records your family might have related to the estate. Do you know if you have anything like that?" Hope looked nonplussed for a moment. "Well, I'm sure we do, but I have to ask my uncle where they are." She stared at the card on his desk for a long moment, then back up at him. "Dr. Ferguson, Cam, I rather thought that you might be able to take a look for me." She glanced back over her shoulder towards his open office door. "Mrs. Cotteridge suggested as much, but obviously I got the wrong end of the stick." She stood, ignoring the business card as she reached for the badge that was still resting on the cleaning cloth. She looked so disappointed, and honestly, Cam couldn't blame her. It would likely take the county archaeologist weeks to get around to looking at her case. Not for want of effort, but like so many other public sector resources, his department had been cut to the bone. As her fingers touched the badge, Cam found himself placing his hand atop hers, holding it in place. When her eyes met his, there was the slightest flare of her pupils, the black widening to swallow the inner edge of the vibrant blue of her irises. "I have some time this weekend," he found himself saying, ignoring the weight of all those unwritten end-of-term reports. "I can at least take a look and try to determine if there really is a need for further investigation." Chapter 4. "She definitely said to turn left at the previous junction," Barney said as he turned in his seat to look back the way they'd just come. The she in question was the sat-nav, and this wasn't the first time it had sent them in the wrong direction. The overgrown hedgerows loomed closer to the car, and Cam tapped the brake, easing their already slow speed down to below 30. "Keep your eyes peeled for somewhere we can turn around," he muttered. Beyond the hedgerows, it was agricultural land as far as the eye could see. They encountered a tractor around one of these blind bends. They were done for. "No signal, of course," his friend sighed as he held up the phone towards the window as though he could coax a bar or two to appear. "Who lives where there's no 4G anyway?" "No one, by the looks of it," Cam observed dryly as he surveyed the open fields around them before turning his attention back to the road. They rounded the corner and were almost plunged into darkness as hedgerows gave way to an avenue of tall trees. The branches on either side curled over the road, the canopy all but blocking out the sun. Cam shoved his sunglasses up on his head, blinking to adjust his eyes to the abrupt change in the light. The trees stretched on and on, one of those stray patches of ancient woodland that had somehow survived when everything else around had been cleared for farmland. Cam glanced down at the sat-nav and groaned. The screen was blank apart from 2 words. No signal. There wasn't much he could do about that now. They'd have to hope the tree cover cleared and they could pick up a signal again. As he drove through the dappled light, Cam gave up looking for a turning spot and just focused on the road ahead. It had to lead somewhere. Eventually. After what seemed like forever, but was probably less than a couple of miles, the wooded area ended as abruptly as it started, and Barney raised a hand to point in front of him. "A spire! Over there on the left! Civilization!" He made it sound as though they'd been navigating through the heart of the Amazon, rather than meandering along a country road for a few miles. "Looks like I won't have to eat you to survive," Cam said with a wry laugh. "Not if that pub does some decent grub," Barney replied with a grin, pointing ahead of them again. Cam rolled up to the junction and stopped. There was no traffic behind them, so he took his time to look around and to try to get their bearings. The lane appeared to have led them into the heart of a village, complete with chocolate box cottages. With their honey-coloured walls, lichen-stained tiled roofs, and gardens brimming with rose bushes, lilac trees and hollyhocks, it looked more like the set of a Sunday evening television show than a real place. A pub stood a short distance from the row of cottages. Well, it more sprawled than sat, the original structure having been extended on both sides over the years. The Stourton Arms proclaimed the long black sign with gold text over the front porch of the pub. A smaller sign on the right of the door promised local ales, good food, and a warm welcome. When she'd given him the postcode, Hope had mentioned that Stourton in the Vale was the village closest to the Juniper Meadows estate. It didn't take Sherlock Holmes to work out that this had to be the village pub. Or at least one of them. "Looks like we're in the right place. We can't be far from the estate, so we can pop in for a spot of dinner on the way home." "We could have a little sampler now," Barney said, voice hopeful. "For quality control purposes." "And turn up at Juniper Meadows with you half cut. What kind of impression would that make?" "The right one?" Barney grinned, not in the least bit apologetic. As he stared at Cam, the grin turned into something sly. "What kind of an impression were you hoping to make? Or should I say, is there someone in particular you're hoping to make an impression on?" The gleam in his eyes made Cam want to squirm in his seat. "We're going to offer our professional opinion to the Travers family. So please, try to remember that you are capable of behaving like a professional." Trying to ignore Barney's laughter, Cam focused on the task in hand. The main road through the village looked a lot wider than the country lane they'd approached from, much to his relief. Glancing left and then right, he searched in vain for a signpost that might give him a hint of which direction he should go. The sat-nav had woken up and was indicating he should turn right, but he didn't have much faith in the blasted thing. "Left or right?" he asked Barney. "The sat-nav says right, so given how useless it's been so far, I say left, towards where we saw the spire. If we can find the church, there's bound to be a signpost nearby, or at least someone to help with directions." Cam gave the sat-nav screen one last look, then tugged the connector out of the socket. "Left it is, then." There was no traffic, so they were able to edge through the village at little more than a crawl, giving them both time to have a good nose around. To their left stood a row of shops. To Cam's surprise, there was a family butcher, an independent greengrocer, and a village store. Round where he lived, the only shop was a late-night convenience store that mostly sold booze and junk food. The Cotswolds stone buildings all had what looked like their original wooden windows, and there was no sign of the ubiquitous chain logos which had crept into most places. Beyond the village store was a cafe, the blackboard on the pavement outside advertising afternoon cream teas. "I could just nip in and ask for directions," Barney said, fooling no one about what was really on his mind. Honestly, for a man who seemed to be ruled by his stomach, Barney had no right to be in such decent shape. "Or we could ask this chap who's just come out of the village store," Cam pointed out. "Spoil sport." Barney lowered his window. "Hello? Excuse me. Can you help us with some directions?" The man paused in the act of untying the lead of a small terrier from a little rail outside the shop and looked up with a smile. "Hello, hello. Lovely morning for it, eh?" Cam wasn't sure what it was a lovely morning for, but he gave the man an encouraging smile as he leaned his head towards Barney's so they could both look up through the open window. "We're trying to find Stourton Hall. Do you know where it is?" The man threw back his head and roared with laughter, as though Cam had made the funniest joke in a year. "Know where it is?" he sputtered through tears of mirth. "Goodness, lad, I can tell you're not from around here. Know where it is, indeed." He muttered the last almost to himself. Cam cast a quick glance at Barney, who gave him a "nope, no idea what's going on" smile. "We have an appointment with Miss Travers."